almost about that time. Right about now.
Right about now. Funk, bunk, 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 soul brother.
Thank you for joining the Right About Now podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I'm really excited to talk about this topic. I don't know why I find the whole generational studies so fascinating. Maybe it's because I was a history major. There's just something about looking back at the generations over time, and kind of understanding why we may do the things we do and why we've done the things we do that really fascinates me. And I'm wondering what sparked your interest to make this your specialty, your discipline.
Well, it goes back, way back, to the early 90s. I was an undergraduate, and I noticed that my fellow students were scoring very differently on a psychological test than the boomers in the early 70s when the test was written and the test manual was put together. So, at first I thought I was scoring it wrong, but then I realized it actually, made a lot of sense from a generational perspective that there would be differences over that 20-year period. And also that was around the same time that the press attention to Gen X was starting to pick up. Somebody had finally realized that young people weren't boomers anymore. So who were they and what was going on? And, there were so lots of books and articles and so on about Gen X around that time. And I loved them. I devoured them. But, I was the next year a grad student in psychology and just realizing these articles and books were guessing. They weren't actually finding real data. They'd say things like, Gen Xers have low self-esteem. I'm like, well, how do you know that? Right. And it turns out it's the opposite. Gen Xers actually profess higher self-esteem, more self-confidence than boomers did at the same age. That's what I found out when I looked at survey data.
Oh, interesting. I mean, it's probably because they were watching Reality Bites, right? Or listening to, Nirvana. I mean, they were kind of getting their cues from like pop culture at the time.
Right. And I mean, those are two pieces of pop culture which kind of are more on the end of, being more depressive and things like that. But then you look at the rest of pop culture that Gen X experienced, things like, kids' TV shows and advice that adults gave them. It was just be yourself, and you shouldn't care what anybody else thinks of you. It was very individualistic. Plus, just think of the brash self-confidence of the pop culture of the 80s. And that's what Gen X grew up with. Yeah.
Well, I should mention here that we're both Gen Xers. Will not age us, but so we can relate on this particular note. But it's going to be interesting to look at all the other generations, and we're going to take a deep dive into each one of them. I'm curious how one defines a generation. It seems like some generations are defined, it's 20 years, and then some are 15. So it seems very arbitrary to me. Like, is there like some central generation council out there, like the emoji council, who like decides like this is now officially a generation? Like, where, like, how is that done? How is that done?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think in this area, pretty much everybody agrees on the big stuff, and then there's disagreement over stuff that's more trivial. So the big stuff is cultures change over time. Living now is very different from what it was like to live 200 years ago or 100 years ago or 50 years ago or even 20 years ago. And that has an impact on people's behaviors and lives and values. Pretty much everybody agrees on that. And that's really the basis for what creates generational differences. But then, where do you put those lines? What are the birth year cutoffs for each generation? How are those decided? There isn't a council. It's really kind of arbitrary where those lines are drawn. There's a few cases where they're clearer. For the baby boom, for example, they're usually defined as those born between 1946 and 1964. Those are demographic cutoffs. Demographers have said those are the years when there was a much higher birth rate. So that's pretty well defined. After that, it becomes a little bit more arbitrary, although I will say that the advent of the smartphone and ubiquitous social media in the early 2010s created a fairly pronounced generational break between millennials, born roughly 1980 to 1994, and Gen Z, born 1995 to probably 2012. And that shows up in the survey data. So I'm a little more confident in that cutoff. The others, say, with particularly Gen X and millennials, is much more debatable.
Right. Why is understanding the differences between the generations so important? What in your mind, why is that an important thing for people to know?
So we can understand each other better.
Hmm.
Because there's been, well, first of all, I think generation gaps right now are just as big as they were, say, in the late 1960s between boomers and their parents.
Hmm.
That was a fundamental generation gap in terms of values and lifestyles and so on. And now it's in communication styles and mental health and views of the world and politics and a lot of other stuff also around core values. And to overcome that, we really have to try to understand each other better. So to understand the perspective of people younger than us and older than us who grew up in a different world,
Yep.
and to try to do that as accurately as possible. And that's the other thing that is really crucial, I think, is to not rely on stereotypes, to not rely on anecdotes, to not rely on just observational stuff. Ask people. Ask
Right.
people how they're feeling, how they spend their time, what's important to them. And the great thing is we live in the age of big data. We have a lot of surveys that have done that. And not only have they done that, they've done it over decades. So we can go back in time and look at what did the boomers look like when they were 18 compared to Gen Z now. We have data on adults going back to the early 70s as well. We can get that broad picture. And that's what I did in the book. Data
Yeah,
on 39 million people.
Wow. I mean, that's what I really like about your work is that it really is data backed. It's scientific. It's not just like, here's what I think or here's what my assumptions based on talking to a bunch of people from different generations. And you're right.
Yeah.
Like your book helped me understand, my kids' generation better. I mean, so my kids are Gen Z.
Mine too.
And yours too, right?
Yep.
So we're on track here. And it's very hard. I mean, even though I've lived with these kids in the same house for the last, 17, 13 years, respectively, I don't always understand why they do the things they do, why they think the things they do, and it is interesting to see, based on the data that you've collected, why they act the way they act, and then to be able to interact with them in a way a little bit more of a compassionate, understanding way instead of being like, I am not using pronouns, that kind of thing. So you argue, I guess one of your kind of big tenet of one of the big sort of messages in your book is that you have to look at technology as playing a significant role in the difference between generations. Like, a lot of people will say, well, it's culture, it's a culture change, but you really believe that technology led to the technological changes led to the cultural changes. Like that it really starts with technology, or it's certainly one of the major pillars. Can you explain that a little bit?
Sure. The kind of classic theories of generations say generations are different because they experienced big events like wars, pandemics, economic recessions and depressions at certain times in their lives.
Right.
So yeah, those things have an impact, but they tend to be short term. They tend to not explain a lot, of the generational differences that are out there that are so stark. Gen Z, wanting people to state their pronouns is a great example. Was that really caused by a major event? Probably not. That doesn't make a lot of sense.
Maybe the invention of Tumblr. Yeah.
Maybe. That's what some people have theorized. But it's a confluence of a lot of different cultural influences. And in writing this book, what I realized is those changes in culture, almost all of them are rooted in technology and technological change in one way or another. And I always want to be clear off the bat, when I'm talking about technology, sure, what we think of is computers and smartphones and social media and things like that.
Right.
But I'm talking about technology more broadly. Things like better medical care, airplanes, air conditioning, labor-saving devices like
Innovation.
washing machines. All kinds of innovations. I mean, and when you think about technology in that way, that's it. That's what makes living now so different from living in the past in so many different ways. Plus, technology has these downstream impacts on culture and lifestyle. So one is that when you have better medical care, people live longer. And then because people have more time, the whole developmental trajectory slows down. Also because education is more necessary in a technologically advanced society. So what that means is called the slow life strategy. It means kids are less independent. Teens are less likely to do adult things like have a driver's license or a paid job or go out on dates when they're in high school.
Okay.
Young adults are take longer to get married and have kids and settle into careers. And middle-aged people look and feel younger than their parents or grandparents did at the same age. So this is the origin of 60 is the new 50, 50 is the new 40, etc. So it has had an impact across all of the generations. Then the other downstream impact of technology is more individualism, more focus on the self and less on social rules. So that's one of the origins of, say, more emphasis on equality. And then you follow that downstream far enough, that's where you get things like we should state our pronouns, is more openness to different gender identities.
It's so interesting that as everything speeds up, the generations tend to slow down. It's sort of interesting contradiction there. And yet it helps me understand better. And, I said, aha, because this idea that, kids are not getting driver's license today. Like that's like all parents, like all my peers that are parents talk about, like, it is so weird that kids don't get driver's license anymore. Like, by the way, my son got a driver's license the day after he turned 16, or whatever. He tried to get, he went to, but he's definitely an outlier because I think that most kids do not have that much interest. And it's like back when we were kids, it was like that was like a rite of passage. Like as soon as you turned 16, you got your driver's permit, and it was like a huge thing of freedom for us.
That's right.
And now, like for this generation, for Gen Z, it isn't. And so that has to do with the sort of everything is going a little bit slower for them, right? They're almost becoming adults a little bit slower because they're going to live longer.
Yep. That's part of it. I mean, technology plays a role directly there as well because they don't have to have the driver's license to go see their friends because the party's on Snapchat.
Yep. Or Uber, they can do. We didn't have Uber.
No, you can't use Uber until you're 18.
Oh, okay.
Plus, the driver's license decline happens in rural areas too, where Uber really isn't an option.
Okay, so that's interesting. I always thought it was the Uber effect. I am wrong about that. And this idea of individualism, there was a time when, the opposite of individualism, I guess, is collectivism, right? So when sort of groupthink was the dominant thought. I don't know. That seems to be sort of maybe after the World War II, but certainly in the older generations. Explain to me why that, why that was the case, and then why it shifted.
Yeah. So I think that post-war period is really key. It's somewhat stereotypical, but there's a grain of truth to the idea of the 1950s being conformist in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
There's certainly exceptions to that. We always have to remember the civil rights movement started in the 50s, so it's not completely uniform. But there were very clear rules for what you were supposed to do in the 50s, especially around gender and family and marriage. Those rules were much more strict than they are today. You were supposed to get married by the time you were at least 25. You were not supposed to be gay or lesbian. It was very rare for people to be out then. You were, if you were female, supposed to stay home with your kids. And again, there were exceptions to that. But very, very clear rules. Oh, and you were never supposed to have a child outside of marriage, ever.
Yeah, I even wonder, were you allowed to, was it permitted to have sex before marriage? Because a lot...
Yes and no.
Okay.
So you weren't supposed to ever live together before you got married. That was not even like on the planet of possibilities. And there was sex, but reliable birth control wasn't much of an option. And so, sure, that happened. But then if you got pregnant, you got married. Shotgun wedding, no questions asked, was almost always the rule.
Because there's a common perception, this might be wrong with the data, but that people got married younger back in the, in my parents' generation because they wanted to have sex. And you couldn't have sex until you got married. Like that was I don't know, is that true, or is that kind of just like a...
No, that's probably part of it. That's certainly probably part of it. And they definitely got married younger. So in as late as 1960, the median age for first marriage for women was 20.
Hmm.
What that means is that half of the women getting married for the first time in that year were teenagers.
Wow. Which is like now, as you talk to our kids, you're not even, oh, this is another real big generational change. My son, he would never date like a freshman. He's a senior now in high school. He would never date a freshman. He wouldn't even date a sophomore because
Mm-hmm.
now to there's like such a kind of sensitivity to age
Power
differences
differentials.
and power differentials, and that he's like you have to overlap in classes. Like if you're a senior, you'd have to be you can only date a junior. That's like the rule. Now I don't know if that's an LA rule, but that is like a sort of, and of course that was not the case when I was younger. A lot of like all the kind of cutest girls went out with the seniors, and it was really annoying for the freshmen. Um, So is that part of the kind of slowing? Like what is that? What explains that? Do you think?
I think that's more around that attention paid to equality and gender roles,
Hmm. Yeah.
of not having too much of that power discrepancy.
Yeah, and I think that's a probably a healthy change. Um, so let's talk. If we can dive into some of the generations, it's so interesting. Some of the things you found it really helped me, and we can start with the silent generation, which is 1925 to
Hmm.
1945, according to your book. This is my parents' generation.
Mine too.
Okay,
Hmm.
so you can relate.
Yeah.
Um, and talk to me. We've talked a little bit about this. We've talked about the
Hmm.
fact that they married young. My mom
Hmm.
married, yep, when she was 21. I think she had me. She had me a little late for silence. She had me at the age of 28, which I think was a little while to wait. I think my parents are probably typically a little bit older than most silents,
Hmm.
but but tell me about. So they got married young. They did they had a lot of kids, right?
They did, yeah. And that's a little more true of the earlier half of the silent
Okay.
generation than the latter. But in 1957, the average woman had 4 children.
Wow.
Yeah.
Amazing. So my mom, I guess my mom grew up in the city, well, didn't grow up in the city, but grew up in Long Island, then moved to the city with my dad. Maybe they were a little hipper and like getting closer to the boomer generation. They're 1939. Um, but yeah, so and this was like, again, this is like you imagine like this is the generation that moved to the suburbs, like out of the city, right? Or is that again a little bit before the greatest generation?
Yeah, I would say that the first generation to do that was the greatest generation, right after World War
Okay.
II. Although, some of the silents born in the 20s probably were in that wave as well.
Right. You have said, or I think I read that you said this was the happiest
Hmm.
generation, just in terms
Yeah.
of psychological health. Is that tell me how you what you found when you looked into
Yeah.
their.
Yeah. So it's based on some of the big surveys that have asked about days of poor mental health, is the way it's summed up. The question asks about you feeling stressed or down, and how many days out of the month people feel that. And that's such a great resource because they get like 100,000 people a year for
Wow,
that, and
amazing.
adults of all ages. And you have that data. I think it started in 1993, so it's just huge, just millions. I think it's 9 million people. So you can break that down by generation and see, okay, controlling for age, trying to take that out of the equation. How does it look? And when you do that, you can see that it's kind of you do from greatest generation to silence. The number of poor mental health days goes down, and then it
Hmm.
goes back up. When you start getting to boomers, even in more recent data, you can see that there's a big survey that was done during the pandemic about stress and depression, and the silent generation, even though they bore the brunt of the pandemic in terms of deaths, hospitalizations, their mental health was actually the best out of all
Amazing.
generations. It's incredible.
Even better, yeah.
Yeah,
Uh,
so they seem to have a resilience, um, maybe partially, that pandemic data may be partially born from life experience of they know
mhm.
that this too shall pass. They have that
Yeah,
perspective. Kind of overall, I think it's also their position in history that most, were not fighting in World War II.
right,
So the greatest generation had that. They didn't know it was PTSD, but it was.
right.
Some of the silent generation was in Korea, but not as many, as in the greatest generation fighting World War II. And then the boomers in Vietnam and all the social
Hmm.
upheaval of the 60s, all of the change in the culture and so on. Plus, the advantage of the silent generation marrying young and having so many kids is they have that family support.
Interesting. Do you think we look it seems like the further you go back in generations, the more favorably we look upon them, like the greatest generation. We call it the greatest generation, right? Like, and then I think of the silence, like they're happy. And again, the data bears it out, but there seems to be almost like a more of tolerance and nostalgia, because as we're going to find, as we kind of get closer to the generations that are like closer to now, there's a lot of negative stuff.
I think it starts to break down as soon as you get to the boomers, though.
Yeah. All right.
Because
so let's
the
talk
boomers have been very widely criticized and
the
reviled.
boomers and the millennials are pretty much the most reviled generations sometimes. But and I don't know how Gen X got away scot-free, but we'll talk about that. But let's
We
talk about the
fly under the
boomers.
radar, and everybody
do.
forgets us. That's how.
I know. Like I said, you did a interview recently with a Gen Xer, a Gen Zer, and he didn't even know. He said he didn't even know a Gen X person, which amazed me. I was like, you probably do. But anyway, we're not that under the radar. But okay, so boomers are 1946 to 1964.
Mm-hmm.
This is the generation. I always think of like Steve Jobs, and
Yep.
this is like right. I don't know why I always think of him first, but like this
He's
is
the quintessential boomer in a lot of
He is
ways.
to me like the quintessential boomer. Like an ex-hippie, but also like that became like a capitalist, like the
Yeah.
ultimate capitalist,
Right.
right? Brilliant, but also seems to be a bit of a narcissist. What is the boomer brand of individualism? Because we've talked about individualism, but they have their own special, unique flavor of individualism. So what
Yes.
is that?
It has two main elements: choice and self-expression. So choice was really at the core of a lot of those conflicts in the late 60s, early 70s between boomers and their greatest and silent generation parents. Of, I'm going to choose to live my life this way. So it's around some of the things we discussed earlier. We're not going to get married. I'm going to have this baby.
Yep.
Outside of marriage is one example. I'm going to have sex outside of marriage. I'm going to choose, to do the things I want to do. That was a lot of the conflict.
And was this a lot? We were talking about technology. Is this a lot because of the pill, because of abortion? Like what this freedom?
Yeah, it's some of it. Technology's at the core, but it was individualism, and that increase in individualism really accelerating. And birth control and other technologies played a role in that, but it was also that shift in values.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If you'd had the technology without the shift in values, you would not have had the shift in behavior. You have to
Right.
think about that change in the attitudes and values. Then the other aspect is self-expression. So we talked about Steve Jobs already as being someone, the quintessential baby boomer. One other person who I think of as a quintessential baby boomer in many ways is Oprah Winfrey. And she's a great example of self-expression, because that is the core value. So if you think back to the 80s when her talk show first became popular, she had that particular brand of listening and empathy and emphasis on self-expression that is very boomer. And that's what really made that show popular, because it was the willingness to talk about anything in a way
Right.
that their parents, were appalled by in many ways. But that openness to discussing everything is also a core boomer value.
That's interesting. Is this one interesting thing you document in your book is how names change over time? So, like, I'm John. Hello, you're Jean. It's probably harder now to find a John and a Jean, and this might change later. But I'm wondering if the boomers start making the thing where instead of having names where you kind of fit in, like Karen, John, Steve, you start having these kind of unusual. You start giving your kids unusual names.
Yeah. So this comes from, and this is such a fun database to play around with, the
Yeah.
Social Security Administration database of baby names, and Google it. You can play around with it yourself. And I did a bunch of analyses on this, starting with the boomers. So that means, their parents kind of started it, but boomers really took it next level with their millennial kids, is the idea that you should give your child a unique name. That the purpose of a name isn't for them to fit in, it's for them to stand out. And that's the fundamental shift in values that underlines that very important behavior of naming your child. And we can see that in, say, if you look at the 10 most popular names for boys and for girls, And you can graph that over time. What percentage of boys and girls had one of those popular names?
Hmm.
And, when it was, baby boomers being born in the 50s, it was pretty high percentages. As much as
Yeah.
5% would have the most popular name, Mary for girls, for example,
Hmm.
or Robert for boys. And for the top 10, like a third or a fourth, would have just one of those 10 names. And then that started to decline with the end result. And in the most recent data, it's about 7% who have one of those names in the top 10. So, of course, which names are popular changes, but it's also that fewer children are given common names.
Hmm. It's interesting. The paradox about boomers is that they were the generation, they were the hippie children, they were the flower children, they were the one free love, sex, and kind of like kind of envisioned utopian society, and yet your data says that they are also incredibly unhappy. They drank a lot. Obviously, we know drug use was up, but maybe drug use not so much recreationally in this case, but just drug use to ease their mental health. Why do you what do you think happened? Like what went wrong?
Yeah. Now, it's a great question. Well, I think the drug use didn't help, but
Hmm.
it is a chicken and egg question, right?
Yeah,
Was it that the drug use led to the mental health issues, or did the mental health issues lead to the drug use? Probably some of both.
yeah,
Um, at the core, is that the rules changed.
yeah.
And, freedom can be great, but it also can be really stressful.
Mm,
That, you have all these choices to make, and if you screw up, it's on you. I mean, that's
yeah.
kind of the fundamental change that boomers experienced. And I think the other thing that's often ignored is that a lot of changes in the economy had a huge and negative impact on boomers. So there's this very common narrative that boomers very economically successful, and then they climbed the ladder of success and then pulled it up so the millennials couldn't climb it after them.
Mm,
Very common narrative online.
yeah.
That ignores a big, big chunk of boomers, especially those who didn't go to college, who ended up with the short end of the stick economically, that they found the world changing under their feet, in the
Hmm.
80s in particular. So, I mean, take somebody, born in 1950
Yeah.
who got a job at a Pittsburgh steel mill, and then
Hmm.
all of those went out of business. And then they're, 30, 35 years old, a little late to go back to college. What do?
Right.
And that isn't just steelworkers, that was a huge swath of working class people. And is mostly boomers who had the big, who were, kind of at the forefront of that, where they were in that age group where it was kind of too old to start over, but too young to
Yeah.
retire.
Was that? I know Richard Nixon used to talk about the silent majority. I wonder if like a lot of those people were those people, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
and I know that was kind of more of a political trick, but like this idea that there were people of that generation that maybe didn't buy into this whole like free love, that was more of a fringe movement, and most people were kind of suffering like the way that you're talking about, like people, the coal miners,
And
where there was more coal mines are
And
still.
I think it's true. Although what's funny about these types of movements, and this one in particular, is that with boomers, yeah, that the free love hippie thing definitely was a minority, probably a pretty
Right.
small minority of the generation.
It gets the
However,
most, yeah, it's the most love.
but
Yeah.
but think about the core values of that group,
Hmm.
not the fringe, commune stuff like that, but the core values of the group: choice, self
Hmm.
expression. We shouldn't be following these outdated social rules.
Right.
That's not fringe. That's not a minority. That's the way we live now. So that they may have been a fringe group in 1968 or even 1972, but they won. Their ideas
Yeah.
took over the culture.
Right. Interesting. For good, for better and worse. And I think,
Better and worse, right?
yeah, because it's like anything, like Steve Jobs, and basically invented the smartphone, which I've heard can be used as a great tool, but it also
Hmm.
can be used, as we see, as a weapon. And
Exactly.
um, so okay, it's a very interesting generation, the boomers, and it gets a lot of Another impression is, I'll move on to boomers, but it is one thing I want to kind of understand, and that is like there is an impression that the boomer generation was a bit self-involved and narcissistic. Does the data bear that out?
Um, yes and no. So the difficulty of trying to study that with boomers is we need data on things like narcissism and self-focus and thinking of yourself as above average and all of those things to compare boomers with silence. And we don't really have it.
Yeah.
It just doesn't really exist because people didn't even start asking about things like that until
I didn't even know really.
late
Narcissism wasn't.
60s at the
Yeah.
earliest. It wasn't even on the
Yeah.
radar screen, right?
Yeah.
Now, we can look at things like language use in books,
Hmm.
and that definitely points in that direction, that there was certainly an increase in people saying, you're special and identity and unique and all of these words. We can see that changing from, say, when it was the silent generation, it was the young adults, to when the boomers were the adolescents and young adults. Um, but I do think that that idea of, boomers is, say, uniquely narcissistic or uniquely self-focused compared to all generations, that we know isn't true because
Yeah.
we do have that data from surveys, and Gen X and millennials in particular built on those trends that the boomers started and ended up embracing that self-confidence, self-focus,
Yeah.
and sometimes narcissism at higher rates than boomers did
Yeah.
at the same age.
For sure. I mean, I think self-empowerment was like, feel like I started hearing that word when I was in my 20s. Like that was like a big thing.
And you probably
And
heard
let's talk.
some, as a Gen Xer, you probably heard some of this when you were younger too. A lot of
Yeah.
the self-esteem boosting, we were the
Yeah.
products of that.
Self-esteem.
That started
That's what
with
I meant. I'm
us.
sorry, I meant self-esteem. Yeah. Like the
Yeah.
word self-esteem.
Yeah.
Yeah, that started with us. So a good seg into Gen X. This is 1965 to 1979. This is like we talked a little bit about them, but they were actually one of the smaller generations. Like they were, there's not as many of us, which
Yes.
is probably why you don't hear from us a lot, right? And that is why, because we were sort of sandwiched between two massive generations. I think there's a perception and versus reality. There's a sort of perception, and maybe this was early Gen X, that we were like the slackers. We were the grunge, like that, like, grunge started becoming a popular type of music when we were, in our 20s. That we love like nostalgia. But anyway, what if you had to summarize what the sort of Gen Xer is and how based on the research you've done, what would you sort of say are common characteristics?
Well, I mean, one thing that shows up is the decline in trust. So trust in others, trust in institutions. Millennials and Gen Z are often characterized by that because those trends continued. They really started when Gen X was young. So I think that's where the reputation for cynicism comes in, is the beginning of that just lack of trust in each other and lack of trust in government, in the media. Even in science and the medical establishment started to show up in the last 10 to 20 years. So like that's one of the key things, is a lot of Gen Xers, even, decades ago, had this feeling that the good times were behind us.
Yeah.
And I think that that's changed, periodically over the years, but that kind of core piece is still there.
Whereas now we look back on that period and we're like, man, those are the good old days.
I know,
That's
right?
Generation, right?
That's
we're like,
right.
The 80s were incredible.
That's right. But it's an interesting contrast to millennials who were very optimistic and very positive when they were young, and then turned cynical later.
Right. Well, just to stick with the Gen X for one sec here, it seems like they would be more like the silence because, in a way, we lived in sort of similar times. No wars, really, no serious wars. We didn't have to go to war. There was a boom, sort of an economic boom in the 80s. And you'd think that we would be sort of optimistic, and yet we had almost the opposite reaction. Like, we're not happy.
Yeah, right. Because it's not just about major events.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's about the way technology changed and individualism changed and lives changed. That
Yeah.
Gen Xers enjoyed a lot of benefits of individualism, so equality being top of the list for sure. But then there were those downsides, like less trust. And where did that come from? I mean, one place that it came from was technology in terms of media. You wonder why does nobody trust the media anymore? Go back and watch things like, Current Affair, or those horrible shows in the 90s. You instantly like, this is when it started to go downhill.
Right. Morton Downey Jr. That was like sort of the beginning of like trash TV.
Yes.
And like Maury Povich and
Jerry Springer.
Yeah. Sorry, Amy. I went to school with Maury Povich's daughter, so sorry, Amy. But it wasn't great. All right. So I'm gonna get off Gen X for a second. Move to millennials. They are, first of all, before we get to millennials, I actually ghost wrote a book many years ago for a guy that was claiming to be Generation Y. Is that really a real thing, or did he just make that up?
So people called millennials Gen Y for a while.
Okay.
And then millennials kind of won out as the generational label.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay. So Gen Y and millennials are the same thing. So this is 1980 to 1994. This is another much derided generation, probably unfairly, but like I know that my kids' Generation Z, do not like millennials at all. And then, my generation, Gen X, I think like my experience with millennials was a lot of the people like I hired over the years when I was in more corporate jobs were millennials. And I would always complain, their work ethic is weird and they want to leave at 5 and they want to do their own, like there was a lot of complaining, like they're lazy. And again, it could just be a generational thing where it's like the older generation looks down on the younger generation. But in some ways, some of their bad rep is true. It's not necessarily their fault. We're not coming down to millennials here, but talk to me about what kind of defines this generation.
Well, I think one thing that really defines millennials is a shift from optimism to pessimism. So as adolescents and young adults, they were happier than Gen Xers were at those ages. They very optimistic. They had extremely high expectations. Very self-confident, more likely to say that they felt they were above average in certain characteristics. And I think that explains why a lot of employees were like, wait, what is this person doing?
It wasn't like this was the end of this mentoring thing where like they didn't want to be mentored. They knew better. That was kind of the very general impression.
And some of that's, some of that's age, some of that's the confidence of youth. And it certainly wasn't every millennial out there. But there was this brash self-confidence, and that has its advantages. Optimism has its advantages. But how could those high expectations possibly be fulfilled? And they weren't. And so now there's a lot of bitterness. To be fair, a lot of that pessimism isn't just millennials. That's kind of across the age and generation scale these days. But there's a really striking pattern with millennials of their happiness being high, their optimism being high. Their mental health picture when they were young was a little bit of a mixed bag, but a lot of really bad indicators, like say youth suicide actually went down during the millennial era. And then now 26 to 34-year-olds depression has started to increase among that group. They had been kind of immune to that for a little bit as Gen Z increased in mental health issues, depression in particular, and now it's moved up the age scale to millennials, which suggests there is some of that disappointment with adulthood, those expectations not being fulfilled, as well as reflecting the overall very pervasive pessimism in the country right now.
So they're just reflecting what is basically happening in the country right now. But what do we have a sense of what's causing this pessimism?
That's a really good question. That was one thing that...
Wish we knew.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, some of it, as we'll get into when we talk more about Gen Z, is that's what depression is. It's not just about emotions, it's about cognition, it's about thinking, and how you view the world. If you view the world through a negative lens, you're probably depressed, at least a little. So just that increase in depression, it's a chicken and egg thing, which came first. And then, so we have to ask what caused the depression, what caused the pessimism. And I do, again, see a big role for technology in both of those trends.
Let's talk about technology. Yeah, because technology is such a huge, has such a major influence on both the millennials and Gen Z.
Yes.
And I And you've written really extensively on this topic and are very concerned about it. I mean, so specifically when we're talking about technology, what are we talking about here? Are we talking about the internet? Are we talking about social media? Is that kind of what we mean?
Yeah, mostly in this case, that's what's having the impact, because these are technologies that affect how we communicate and relate to each other. So the standard has shifted, particularly among teens, but also increasingly young adults and older adults too, that social interaction happens online instead of face to face. And that's not a good recipe for mental health, because online communication is not as good for mental health as face to face social interaction.
That I think we saw that, during COVID, what happened to our kids when they were kind of forced to be alone in their rooms with their computer. Like, it was like devastating effect on some children still not coming out of it.
Although, I mean, what's amazing though is a lot of kids were doing that voluntarily even before the pandemic hit.
Yeah,
that the trends were already heading in that direction. I sometimes say Gen Z was in dress rehearsal for the pandemic even before it happened.
So this is, we were all about high self-esteem, our generation, and Gen Z. We're going to start with the negative here, and we can start with the positive. Did they ever were they ever optimistic? Did these poor kids coming into this world, I feel guilty because this is the world that we're giving them. Did they ever feel optimistic about things?
Not really. And that's the huge shift. So my previous book called iGen is about Gen Z, and I was inspired to write it because I was seeing changes in this national survey data that were really unprecedented. I'd never really ever seen changes that were so big over such a short period of time. And it was things like more teens saying they felt lonely and left out, that they felt like they couldn't do anything right, that they didn't enjoy life, that they didn't think their life was useful. And those last three are symptoms of depression. And that self-esteem also, those indicators of feeling self-confident also started to go down. And it was all right around the same time, around 2012. Just everything.
And this was
across the board. Happiness went down, expectations went down, behaviors.
And this was when
too.
The phone became more
omnipresent.
omnipresent.
That's when the phone became, smartphones became common. Social media moved from optional to virtually mandatory among teens around that time. The character of social media also changed around that time, became much more visual. It's around the time Facebook bought Instagram. Smartphones started to have front-facing cameras. It was when a lot of that stuff changed. Teens also started spending less time with each other face-to-face, and they started spending less time sleeping. And you put all of that together, that is a very bad formula for mental health.
Wow. Now, the idea of being face-to-face, why is that so important? The human interaction as opposed to, because, our kids think, in a sense, it'll be interesting. Like, I'm sure you've had this experience where my kids will be in a room with all their friends, but they're all on their phones, which is like this bizarre thing. And, my reaction is like, you guys go out and play like we used to do, and they do that. And I think my kids think, knock on wood, are pretty healthy and adjusted kids, but I do see them doing that. And what is it about even though they're together, they're still on their phones. What is it about that face-to-face interaction that's so important for mental strength?
Yeah. It builds that emotional connection with someone else. And it's also just a fundamentally different experience than, say, especially social media, which isn't really, even though it has the word social in its name, it's very performative. And it's about likes and followers. And, that cycle of dopamine and disappointment that happens so often, and the body image issues and all of those things. It's not just about communication with friends. There's also this larger audience, and that's where a lot of the problems come in. But even if you compare just, face-to-face social interaction with texting, I mean, texting is a pale shadow compared to all of the feedback that you get and the emotional closeness you get from speaking with someone in real time in the same room.
Yeah. They don't even text anymore. Now it's just like emojis. And also... I noticed this generation and millennials to some degree don't even like to email. And there's something about, and again, they're all kind of distant, but I think there's something about having to form an email and like sentences and like full, complete thoughts that might be more valuable. I don't know, but it is interesting that they've completely rejected email. Like I cannot communicate with my kids through email. Like they won't even look at their emails.
Yeah. So
I don't know what
the kind of trope goes like this. The boomer wants to see you in person. The Gen Xer wants to send you an email. The millennial wants to text you, and the Gen Z wants to make a TikTok video.
It feels about right. I mean, it's obviously a stereotype,
Yeah.
but it also, like from what you're saying, it's pretty true. Is there, and it's worse for girls, right? Which is another sad thing. Is that because of the body image stuff? And
Probably. It's also just the way girls communicate with each other. Social media is a perfect storm for bullying, the type of bullying that girls do to each other, and social rejection. That's where it can play out.
ugh, see, this was all supposed to bring us together and make us one world, you know, and like I said, that the idea of it being a tool and a weapon, like,
Yeah.
it's just so sad that something that had so much potential could have done so much harm.
And it still does. I mean, that I think that's the
Yeah.
thing that is, the most distressing is these technologies are amazing. It's just they're very unregulated. And so it basically moves to the lowest common denominator like really quickly. Plus, really young kids are on social media and it's not designed for them. So I and a lot of other people are starting to advocate that the minimum age for social media should be raised to 16, and we should actually verify age.
And I know that'll completely freak out kids, but it makes a lot of sense. I mean, even
It won't
television.
as much as you
these-
might think. They're actually surprisingly
Yeah.
open to things like that.
Really?
Yeah.
Tell me about, like, when you've surveyed them and when they've
Yeah.
been polled.
Yeah.
It's kind of like people want you to set guidelines. They don't want
Yes,
to set their
that's
own.
what it
They
is.
want you to set
That's what it is.
guardrails.
And to be clear, I haven't done surveys on this of young people. It is more anecdotal and just in talking to young people, when I give talks at middle schools and high schools and so on. But that's what they want. They want guidelines to be set because they're struggling with this so much.
That's really interesting. Well, I'm with you on this one. I'm a believer in free speech, but I also believe, we put regulations on TV. You couldn't watch everything on TV. You could, I don't know. Even TV should have been regulated somewhat back in the day, because look at the damage the television did. And now it's the internet. So there is and one last thing about this Gen Z thing, it's not just unique to Americans. This is happening across
That's
the
right.
world, right?
That's right.
Which means even further, boosts your argument that this is this is not just a cultural or American phenomena.
Yeah, that's right.
This is
Because those
everywhere.
increases in depression and anxiety and mental health issues are showing up worldwide. And that,
Yeah.
again, points to a cause that is worldwide, like technology, unlike, say, Trump's election or school shootings or some of the other explanations that have been suggested.
All right, so there's one other generation that's coming up. We don't know a lot about them yet because they were born in 2013. My kids are not this generation, and you call them the polars. Why do you call them the polars?
After melting polar ice caps and political polarization. So they're often
That
called
makes a lot
Gen
of sense.
Alpha, but that's a continuation of the idea we're going to name the generations with letters, and whoops, we ran out with Z, so now we have to
Yeah.
start over. Let's use the Greek alphabet. It's all very repetitive and boring, and I think we need to go back to the generational labels that say something about the generation's experience.
That's true. Although the polars might strike that as a bit negative, that it's two things that nobody particularly likes. It's true, but not two things that they don't
So
particularly
maybe
like
there'll be
about.
another label. I just hope it's not
Yeah,
alphas.
it'll
And
come. I like polars.
I'm not a huge fan of Gen Z either, although it seems to have caught on.
Yeah, Gen Z doesn't make any sense. Was it just XYZ? That was why.
And then we
Yeah.
skipped Y because Gen Y didn't stick
Yeah.
for millennials, so it just doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't make any sense, and it is arbitrary how these names come up because, we didn't talk about this, but Gen X was the name of a book, Douglas Copeland book, but it was actually about a generation that was actually a little bit
It
younger.
was actually about
than-
late boomers. Yeah.
Yeah,
Although it
right,
did, it did fit in many ways, and I actually do think Gen X still kind of fits. We're still kind of undefined. We're still
Yeah.
kind of this, on the edge thing.
Yeah.
But the other letters, let's skip that.
It strikes me that now that I just am realizing, I would imagine that Elon Musk is Gen X. Maybe
He is.
Maybe
He was born the same year as me.
Yeah.
Yep.
So he's obsessed with he's always been obsessed with X.
Oh my
You
God,
know,
I
he
didn't
just
even
renamed
think of
Twitter.
that. But you're
I didn't even
right.
think about
Yeah,
that.
he
He
renamed
just-
Twitter X. Maybe
He
that's
renamed Twitter
why.
X. Yes, and he SpaceX,
Right.
and X is a huge thing for him. Interesting.
Yes.
Okay, I just discovered something. Okay, polars, alphas. I mean, they're only 10 years old at this point, but do we have any research on what they're like? Are they just going to be another continuation of Gen Z? I mean, they are growing up in the like they don't know anything different than social media.
Yeah.
Maybe a lot of them aren't able to get on social media yet because they're too young, and hopefully their parents are keeping them away. I know that
Yeah,
we
I don't
tried
know.
to
That's
keep
the
our kids
problem. I
away.
think a lot of them are. Um,
Yeah.
I mean, and we know that from surveys that yeah, fifth and sixth graders, there a lot of them are on social media. Not all, but too many. Um, so that's one thing that's shaping them. We don't have a lot of data yet, so there is good government data on some health behaviors. So pollers are not getting as much exercise as children as previous generations did, which makes sense again,
Right.
given that they're maybe inside with the tablet. And
Right.
perhaps as a result of that, rates of childhood obesity are at all-time highs.
Another cheery podcast. No, I mean, I hope, you just want another greatest generation. I mean, I just, I mean, it's on us, right? I mean, we need to guide children. And I sort of, do you wonder, like, what can you do as a parent? I mean, so now you're
Mm-hmm.
aware of, like, it's like you have to just basically, I guess, educate yourself on what is going on now and
Mm-hmm.
how you can beat these trends, right? So as a parent, if you know that they're not getting as much exercise, well, that's a incentive for you to sort of try to
Yeah,
encourage more exercise.
that's right. And
Yeah.
keep them off social media. And
Yeah.
now
Set
I always want
limits.
to acknowledge parents are in an extremely difficult position with this because you don't need parental permission to open a social media account. It's one of the many ways in
Hmm.
which it's very unregulated, and they don't verify age. So there's 9 and 10-year-olds on TikTok and their parents have no idea. So
Right.
trying to just kind of think about this. So one thing is put off getting your kid a smartphone for as long as possible
Hmm.
or tablet. Just don't give them their own device. Then you have a better idea of what they're doing. So get them a flip phone or get them a Gab phone. My 13-year-old has
Yeah.
one of these. We just ordered one for my 11-year-old because that
Interesting.
phone can call, text, and that's it. No internet
That's
access, no social media. You can't download apps without parental permission.
Here's my hope, and this could be a fantasy, is that just the way boomers kind of rejected, the past, the silence, at a certain point, isn't a generation going to fight against the sort of norm of their previous generation? So it's like
Mm-hmm.
Gen Z and millennials created social media basically, or at least they didn't necessarily create it, but they made it.
Gen X and
Uh,
millennials
they,
created it.
yeah, yeah, we created it, and they've had to live with it. But you feel like there might be a rebellion, just the way like people rebelled against, the music of their time and created rock and roll. Maybe there will be a kind of like a return to like flip phones, or I don't know, or just like I mean, my daughter's already having nostalgia for things that are like 20, 25, 30 years old, like vinyl, and even like she wants to use these point and shoot cameras rather than using her phone camera. I'm just hoping that there might be some sort of like it's not cool to be on social media anymore. I don't know. It's hard to imagine that
Yeah.
ever being true, but
Yeah,
I have
and
a, I have a,
I think there is that feeling, and I think there's a lot of young activists who are speaking out
Mhm.
about social media needing to be more regulated.
Yeah,
The tough part is these companies have poured billions of dollars
right.
into getting us all effectively addicted. So,
Yeah,
we're fighting against that. And who can compete against that? That's the difficulty. That's why we need
yeah,
more regulation.
yeah. At least we can start with regulation and hope the culture kind of follows, where
Hmm.
it's like we don't want to be sick anymore. We don't want to be sad anymore. Um, all right, there's so much to think about here. Gene Twenge, what a great book. It's called Generations: The Real Difference Between Gen Z, Millennials, Gen X, Boomers, and Silence, and what they mean for America's future. I love this book. It's a really interesting read. Even though you're an academic, it is not like it doesn't read like an
Thank
academic,
you. I
and I say that in
tried.
a nice way.
Yeah. Make
I
it
say
make
that
it
in a nice way.
interesting and, have it.
Why did you decide to be a writer? Because a lot of academics are
Yeah.
not writers, but you chose to
Yeah.
be a writer. Tell me a little bit
Well,
about
because
that.
I almost wasn't an academic, I almost was a writer.
Oh,
Yeah,
really?
in college, I wrote for the college newspaper, was the news editor for a while. Wrote a column junior and
Awesome.
senior
About
year.
what?
So that's what I really love doing. So when I went the academic route, I tried as soon as I possibly could to get back to that side of also, stepping away from the more academic style of writing to write, for a wider audience, to put in the pop culture and the humor and the personal experiences of people who I talk to, and just make it real. That's what I wanted.
Yeah. Well, it really is real and it really resonates. And thank you so much for writing, and I'm looking forward to reading all your next books. Is there anything, if people want to find out more information about you, do you have a website? Do you like the people to follow you on social media? What's the best way to connect with
Yeah,
Jean?
so my website is jeantwangy.com. I just started a Substack.
Oh,
So
cool.
yeah, I'm gonna try to post there about new research and developments. Kind of taking a summer hiatus, but I'll probably put something up in the
Yeah,
next
it's hard to get. I
something
have
new.
one, and yet I'm pretty bad, as my
Yeah,
listeners know.
you have to. It's hard to keep up with it, and over the summer that's been
Yeah,
tough. But I think I have two posts I already know I'm gonna put up in the next couple of weeks or so, just
awesome.
highlighting new research on
Is it
generational
called just Jean?
differences,
What's it called? The
mental health.
Substack.
It's called Generation Tech.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. Makes sense. I love it. Well, you have the perfect expertise for a Substack because it's very specific, and that it's harder for generalists, to be honest with you. But anyway, thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to that. I'll definitely subscribe. And until we meet again.
All right, thanks so much.
Yay, Gen X. Go Gen X.